Black woman challenges racist crew. Her power shakes the airline and shocks everyone. At 300 feet, a quiet confrontation unfolded that would shake an airline to its core and leave every passenger in stunned silence. What started as a routine flight turned into a battle for dignity and respect. Meet Maya Jackson, a poised and accomplished professional who has spent decades navigating the challenges of corporate America. At 45, Maya is no stranger to hard work. She's a senior executive in her field, traveling frequently to lead high-stakes meetings and conferences. To her, flying first class isn't a luxury, it's a necessity after years of grueling schedules. But her success doesn't shield her from the weight of systemic biases that follow her at every turn. On this particular day, Maya boarded her flight, seeking a moment of peace after an exhausting week. However, a seemingly ordinary request from a flight attendant would quickly spiral into something far more significant. Maya, the only black passenger in first class, found herself questioned about her seat while other passengers went unchallenged. What began as a quiet interaction soon turned into a defining moment, exposing the microaggressions and systemic biases that people like Maya face daily. This isn't just a story about a plane ride. It's about resilience, visibility, and standing firm against the forces that try to diminish who you are. As Maya's journey unfolded, it would spark outrage, solidarity, and a ripple effect that extended far beyond the cabin. Stay with us as we dive into Maya's story, a tale that challenges the status quo and reminds us of the quiet strength it takes to stand tall in spaces that often work to exclude you. Would you act differently if you witnessed this moment? Let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to hit subscribe for more real-life stories that matter. Now, the airport buzzed with the familiar hum of hurried travelers weaving through security lines, clutching boarding passes, and dragging suitcases behind them. Fluorescent lights bathed the bustling terminal in a harsh glow, reflecting off polished tiles. Business people scrolled through emails, families corralled children toward gates, and vacationers carried the excitement of new destinations. So amid the chaos, Maya Jackson walked with deliberate ease, a calm presence that seemed to part the waves of frenetic energy around her. Maya wasn't in a rush. Her black suit was impeccably tailored, fitting like armor that announced her presence without words. Her heels clicked purposefully against the marble floor, a rhythm that echoed her quiet confidence. She wasn't just walking to her gate. She was claiming her space in a world that often tried to deny it. When she approached the gate, the young agent glanced at her boarding pass with a polite but fleeting smile. "Enjoy your flight, Ms. Jackson," the agent said, her tone professional but tinged with something unspoken. Maya caught the slight hesitation, the flicker of surprise in her eyes, before stepping aside. It wasn't the first time she'd seen that look, and it wouldn't be the last. The first-class cabin was only half full when Maya boarded. She placed her carry-on beneath the seat and settled by the window. Around her, other passengers barely noticed her presence until a flight attendant approached. "Excuse me, ma'am," the attendant said, clipboard in hand. Her voice carried a polite edge, but her eyes held something sharper. "I'll need to see your ticket again." Maya's stomach sank, a familiar feeling. She handed over her ticket without a word, noticing the unnecessary scrutiny. The attendant lingered, inspecting the ticket longer than necessary, before returning it with a clipped, "Thank you." Maya offered a small smile, but the encounter left the air heavy with something unspoken. The battle had begun before the plane even left the ground. Maya Jackson sat quietly by the window, her laptop tucked away and a book resting on her lap. She took a deep breath, trying to unwind after the hectic week behind her. The low hum of the engines and the muted conversations around her offered a fragile sense of calm. But it didn't last. A shadow fell across her seat. She looked up to see the flight attendant, clipboard in hand, her expression neutral, but her eyes betraying an unspoken tension. "Excuse me, ma'am," the attendant began. "Can I see your ticket again?" Maya's brow furrowed slightly. "You've already seen it," she replied, her voice even but firm. The attendant's polite smile tightened. "I just need to verify it one more time," she said, her tone carrying an authority that dared not to be questioned. Maya reached into her blazer pocket and handed over the ticket without a word. The attendant scanned it, her eyes lingering on the details, as if deciphering something far more complex than a seat assignment. After an unnecessarily long pause, she returned the ticket. "Thank you," she said. Her tone clipped. "Sometimes there's confusion." Maya looked directly at her. "I wasn't confused," she said, softly but pointedly. The attendant blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Enjoy your flight," she said curtly before walking away, leaving a ripple of unease in her wake. Maya exhaled, hoping that would be the end of it. But minutes later, the same attendant returned, this time louder and more assertive. "Miss Jackson," she began, her voice carrying through the cabin, ensuring that nearby passengers could hear. "I'm afraid there's been an issue with your seat assignment. It seems this seat wasn't properly allocated." Maya set her book down, her gaze unwavering. "No," she said firmly. "I paid for this seat, and I'm staying in it." "Who else is here?" Passengers nearby began to shift in their seats, pretending not to listen but clearly curious. The attendant's polite veneer began to crack. "Look," she said, her voice dropping. "I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding. Sometimes people end up in places they don't belong." Maya's eyes narrowed. "And where exactly do you think I belong?" Before the attendant could answer, a voice cut through the tension. "She's right." An older woman, her silver hair neatly pinned back, leaned forward from 2 rows behind. Her voice was steady but sharp. "I've been watching. You've checked no one else's ticket but hers. Why is that?" The flight attendant stiffened, her gaze darting nervously around the cabin. Maya stayed silent, letting the older woman's words linger in the air. Around them, passengers began to murmur, their quiet observation giving way to subtle solidarity. Maya turned back to the window, her heart steady, but her resolve unshaken. She hadn't asked for this confrontation, but she wouldn't back down. This was about more than a seat. It was about standing firm in a world that too often tried to make her shrink. The cabin was still as the flight attendant, clipboard gripped tightly in her hands, returned to Maya Jackson's seat. Her smile was gone, replaced by a rigid professionalism masking growing frustration. Around them, the low murmur of passengers' conversations had subsided, the tension hanging thick in the air. "Miss Jackson," the attendant began, her voice louder than before, "we've reviewed the seating chart and it appears there was an error in your seat assignment. I'll need you to move to the main cabin." Maya closed her book slowly and set it on the tray table. Her gaze was calm but unyielding as she looked up at the attendant. "There's no error," she said firmly. "This is my seat. I paid for it, and I'm not moving." The attendant's composure cracked for a split second before she adjusted her posture. "I'm sure we can find another solution," she said, her tone laced with forced politeness. "But I'll need your cooperation." Maya leaned back in her seat, crossing her arms. "You seem very focused on my cooperation," she said, her voice steady. "How cooperative have the other first-class passengers been? Because I didn't see you check their tickets." Passengers nearby exchanged uneasy glances. The tension was no longer confined to the row. It had spread through the cabin like an unspoken ripple. Across the aisle, a man lowered his newspaper, his expression betraying discomfort. 2 rows back, the silver-haired woman from earlier sat with her arms crossed, watching intently. The flight attendant opened her mouth to reply, but stopped as another voice entered the conversation. "What seems to be the problem here?" The captain, a tall man with gray hair and an air of authority, appeared beside the attendant. His name tag read Captain Monroe, and his expression was one of practiced diplomacy. Maya met his gaze without hesitation. "There's no problem, Captain," she said. "I'm sitting in the seat I paid for." The captain glanced at the flight attendant, who quickly interjected. "Captain, there's been some confusion about Miss Jackson's seat. We've asked her to move, but she's refusing." Maya tilted her head slightly. "Confusion?" she said, her voice cutting through the thin explanation. "Or is it that I'm the only one being asked to prove I belong here?" The captain shifted uncomfortably, the weight of her words visibly sinking in. "Miss Jackson," he began, his tone carefully measured, We're trying to resolve this quietly. I'd appreciate your cooperation to avoid escalating the situation." Maya's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "Quietly," she repeated. "Do you mean quietly for everyone else or for me? Because I've spent my entire life navigating these quiet moments." The silver-haired woman leaned forward again, her voice sharp. "She's right, Captain," she said. "I've been sitting here the whole time. No one else has been asked to move. Why is that?" Captain Monroe hesitated, his gaze flickering between the passengers who were now openly watching. Across the aisle, a younger woman whispered to her seatmate, and a man behind Maya shook his head slightly in silent disapproval. The captain sighed, his carefully constructed authority fraying at the edges. "Miss Jackson," he said, "if you continue to refuse, I'll have no choice but to escalate this further." Maya uncrossed her legs and sat up straighter, her voice unwavering. "Go ahead. Escalate it. I'd love to hear you explain why I'm the only one being questioned." For a moment the cabin fell silent. The captain exchanged a tense glance with the flight attendant, whose grip on her clipboard had tightened to the point that her knuckles turned white. Around them, the air was thick with unspoken solidarity and simmering outrage. The captain finally relented, his shoulders sagging slightly. "Fine," he said. "We'll discuss this later." He turned and walked back toward the cockpit, leaving the flight attendant standing awkwardly beside Maya's seat. After a moment, she too retreated, her frustration barely concealed. The silver-haired woman gave Maya a small nod of encouragement. "You handled that well," she whispered. "They were hoping you'd back down." Maya nodded but said nothing, her focus returning to the clouds outside the window. She hadn't wanted this confrontation, but she wouldn't shrink from it either. Around her, the passengers settled back into uneasy silence, their discomfort a reflection of their own complicity. Maya's resilience was clear, her refusal to move a quiet act of defiance against the systemic indifference that had long gone unchecked. The tension lingered, but for now, Maya had held her ground. The battle wasn't over, but she had made her presence and her right to be there undeniable. The tension in the first-class cabin was palpable, a quiet storm that had drawn the attention of every passenger. Though the flight attendant had retreated to the galley, the energy she left behind lingered. Maya Jackson sat resolutely in her seat, her hands folded calmly in her lap, her expression a mask of composure. Inside, however, she could feel the strain, the emotional toll of having to defend her presence in a space she had rightfully earned. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man glanced toward her, then quickly looked away, guilt or discomfort flickering in his expression. The silver-haired woman, 2 rows back, leaned forward again, her voice breaking the silence. "I hope you know you're not alone in this," she said, her tone firm but kind. "I've been watching, and I'm with you." Maya turned slightly, meeting the woman's gaze. She nodded, her lips pressing into a faint smile. "Thank you," she said quietly. The support, though small, felt monumental in that moment. A murmur of agreement rippled through the cabin. A younger man a few rows behind added, "It's not right. They didn't question anyone else." Others nodded subtly, their quiet affirmations filling the gaps where words failed. For the first time since the confrontation began, Maya felt the tide shift. The crew, it seemed, had noticed too. Minutes later, the flight attendant returned, her demeanor more subdued. Gone was the rigid professionalism. In its place was something more tentative, almost apologetic. She bent slightly toward Maya's seat, speaking in a low voice that carried just enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Miss Jackson, the captain has decided there's no need to reassign your seat. I apologize for the confusion." Maya looked at her, her face calm but her eyes sharp. "Confusion?" she repeated. "This wasn't confusion. This was a decision. One I won't let you forget." The attendant's face flushed and she straightened abruptly. "Enjoy the rest of your flight," she said, before walking away quickly, her composure visibly frayed. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, the cabin settled into an uneasy calm. Passengers gradually returned to their books, tablets, and conversations, but the memory of what had unfolded lingered in the air. Maya stared out the window, watching the clouds drift below, her thoughts a tangle of exhaustion and quiet pride. This wasn't the first time she had faced a moment like this. In hotel lobbies, boardrooms, and upscale restaurants, the question of her right to occupy certain spaces had been posed in subtle but cutting ways. Each instance left its mark, but today felt different. The murmurs of support from fellow passengers, though small, gave her hope. It wasn't a revolution, but it was a reminder that change, however slow, could begin with a single voice, and sometimes with the courage to refuse to move. As the plane began its descent, the silver-haired woman leaned forward once more. "You handled that with grace," she said softly. "I don't know if I could have done the same." Maya turned to face her, her voice steady, but tinged with weariness. "We all have to, eventually," she said. "The only way things change is if we refuse to stay quiet." When the plane landed, Maya waited for the aisle to clear before standing. Her movements were deliberate, her posture as composed as when she'd first boarded. As she walked toward the exit, she caught the eyes of a few passengers, who nodded silently, their expressions a mix of respect and understanding. At the door, the flight attendant from earlier stood stiffly, her smile strained. "Thank you for flying with us, Miss Jackson," the attendant said, her tone tight with forced politeness. Maya paused, meeting her gaze. "Thank you," she replied, her voice measured, "for reminding me how much work there's still left to do." As she stepped into the terminal, the cool air hit her face, washing away the stale tension of the cabin. The weight of the confrontation lingered, but so did the quiet victory. Maya knew this wasn't the end of these battles, not for her, and not for others like her. But today, she had stood firm, and sometimes that was enough. As Maya Jackson walked through the terminal, her mind lingered on the confrontation. The tension of the moment had passed, but the emotional weight remained. This wasn't the first time she had been forced to justify her presence in a space she rightfully occupied. It wasn't the first time she'd felt the sting of doubt in the eyes of others who couldn't reconcile her confidence, her success, or her belonging with the color of her skin, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. This incident, Maya realized, was not unique to her. It was part of a much larger pattern, a constant undercurrent of microaggressions and systemic bias that people of color, especially black women, endure every day. These moments often go unnoticed by others, dismissed as misunderstandings or oversights, but for those who experience them, they accumulate like invisible weights, shaping how they move through the world. On that flight, Maya had faced a direct challenge to her worth and belonging, cloaked in the guise of protocol. The flight attendant had asked her to move, under the pretense of a seating error, but it wasn't about the seat. It was about the unspoken rules of spaces like first class, rules that dictate who is supposed to be there and who isn't. These rules aren't written in policies or procedures. They're etched into the attitudes and assumptions of individuals, reinforced by systems that quietly uphold them. Let's be honest here. Maya reflected on how exhausting it was to constantly navigate these spaces, whether it was the gate agent's fleeting surprise, the flight attendant's scrutiny, or the captain's thinly veiled dismissal. Each moment was a reminder that her presence was seen as an exception, not the norm. She thought of all the times she had chosen not to fight back, not because she agreed, but because the effort felt like too much. These battles, though seemingly small, drained more than energy. They took a piece of her peace, her dignity, her humanity. Yet this time, Maya had decided to push back. And what struck her most was how quickly the tide turned when others began to voice their support. The silver-hazed woman who spoke up, the murmurs of agreement from passengers, even the subtle nods of solidarity. All these small acts created a ripple that forced the crew to reconsider their actions. It reminded Maya of something her grandmother used to say: "When you stand up, you give others permission to stand with you." Maya understood, however, that allyship could not stop at quiet agreements or subtle nods. Real change required more. It demanded that people challenge the systems that perpetuated these biases. It required them to recognize the ways they benefited from these systems, even unintentionally, and to actively dismantle them. Silence and inaction, Maya knew, only favored the aggressor. The issue went beyond individual prejudice, it was systemic. From corporate boardrooms to airplane cabins, society is riddled with unspoken hierarchies that dictate who belongs where. These hierarchies are maintained through subtle mechanisms, extra scrutiny, second-guessing, and policies applied selectively. They allow discrimination to thrive under the guise of normalcy, making it easy for those in power to deflect responsibility. It was just a misunderstanding, they say. But Maya knew better. Misunderstanding was a convenient word used to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths. Maya thought about the necessity of allyship in these moments. The passengers who supported her hadn't solved the systemic problem, but they had shifted the immediate power dynamic. They had made it harder for the crew to hide behind plausible deniability. Allyship, Maya realized, wasn't just about speaking up in the moment. It was about examining one's own biases, questioning assumptions, and refusing to participate in systems that excluded or diminished others. As she exited the terminal, Maya felt a mix of exhaustion and quiet resolve. Her mind drifted to the many others who faced similar moments of discrimination, but didn't have the energy, platform, or support to push back. She thought about the woman sitting in economy, the man at the back of the restaurant, the child told to lower their voice. Each confrontation, big or small, was part of a larger story, a story of resilience, resistance, and the slow, difficult work of change. On the corner, Maya knew this fight wasn't hers alone. It belonged to everyone who had ever been questioned, diminished, or dismissed, because they didn't fit into someone else's narrow view of belonging. And it wasn't a fight she could win alone. It required a collective effort, a willingness to see, to listen, and to act. As she stepped into the sunlight outside the airport, Maya felt the weight of the moment begin to lift. She had stood firm, not just for herself, but for what was right. And as she walked toward her car, she resolved to keep standing, knowing that every step forward, no matter how small, was a step toward a world where no one would have to justify their presence again. Maya Jackson's story is a testament to resilience, courage, and the power of standing firm in the face of injustice. Her quiet defiance on that flight wasn't just about holding her seat. It was about asserting her dignity and challenging the unspoken rules that too often govern spaces like these. Maya's ability to stand tall, even under scrutiny, reminds us all of the strength it takes to persist in a world that so often asks you to shrink. Her experience also forces us to reflect on our own roles in creating or challenging these dynamics. How often do we question our assumptions or speak up when we witness unfair treatment? Are we silent spectators? Or are we allies willing to disrupt the status quo? True change requires more than passive agreement. It demands action, empathy, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Maya's story teaches us that progress is never easy, and victories are rarely clean. Each moment of resistance, no matter how small, creates ripples that push the boundaries of what's acceptable. It's a reminder that allyship can turn the tide, and that the voices of many are stronger than the silence of complicity. As we reflect on Maya's journey, let us consider the work that remains. Let us examine our own biases and challenge the systems that perpetuate exclusion. And most importantly, let us commit to being the kind of allies who don't just stand by, but stand up. Maya Singer. In the words of Maya's grandmother, when you break something, you don't ask the pieces for forgiveness. You start the long work of putting it back together. Change is never easy, but it begins with recognizing the cracks and choosing to act. If this story resonated with you, share it. Comment with your thoughts on how we can create a more inclusive world, and subscribe to this channel to hear more real-life stories that deserve to be heard. Together, we can amplify these voices and push for the change we all want to see.